Hello everybody and welcome to this live on ServiceNow webinar. So our topic for today is the changes in the supply risk regulation and how organizations can really prepare for it. So today joining me is Ulrich Flamm from ServiceNow and Stephen Reagan from Wrangu. Thank you for being here. So Uli has been with ServiceNow since 2019 in multiple sales management roles and is now responsible for the risk portfolio here in the DACH region. And Stephen is a privacy and compliance consultant, and apart from being an attorney, he's also a fellow at the Center for Internet and Human Rights. And my name is Jenny Stieg. I'm a sales manager at Wrangu. So just before we start, a few household things. So we are recording this session, and the recording will be shared with you after the session. We have a short question and answer section in the end, so ask our experts here in the room, and please feel free to already ask those questions in the Q&A section, which is on the bottom of your screen. So with regards to the agenda, so we will start with Stephen, and Stephen will introduce us to the supply chain regulations that are already in place, supply chain regulations that are about to come. So for example, the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, and also explain a little bit what that will mean for organizations going forward. Then I'll have a little discussion with Uli about, so what does that mean for our customers? What do you see with your customers, and really make it all very tangible, I think. Yeah. Third point is that we're going to show you how a solution on ServiceNow looks like. So it's a solution that is using ServiceNow's vendor risk management and ServiceNow's IRM, together with a solution package that we built for the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. And as I said, last but not least, there is a chance to ask your questions. And with having that said, I would like to hand over to Stephen. Please, Stephen, take it away and tell us a little bit about what that landscape looks like.
Yeah, super. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Jenny. I want to begin kind of just by laying out the context and the landscape for due diligence obligations in the supply chain, looking at the EU as well as the United States. Of course, at the moment, much of the focus is on the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act that comes into force at the beginning of next year for large companies, but it is by no means the only law in place. So in 2015, to start with, kind of this modernization of due diligence in the supply chain, we had the United Kingdom enact the Modern Slavery Act. In 2017, France published the duty of vigilance. In 2019, the Netherlands introduced their Child Labor Due Diligence Act. And then there is a scattering or fragmentation of laws that cover many aspects of due diligence in the United States. And at the beginning of this year, we had the publication of the draft EU due diligence law. So something to look towards perhaps at the end of this year or early into the next year. And really, and I'm going to go look a little bit into these other laws before turning a little more in depth into the German law, because the German law really provides a comprehensive scope for organizations who might not be in one of these other countries, but are looking also towards the future of compliance with due diligence in the supply chain. So I wanted to go a little bit in depth into these other laws because the scope of application is different, as well as the areas that are being regulated. So again, this UK Modern Slavery Act covers companies who meet a certain monetary threshold, so who have annual turnover of 36 million or more pounds and supply goods and services in the UK. The expectation there is that organizations will publish an annual statement on steps to deal with modern slavery in the supply chain. And so that's something that we will go back to when we look at the German law. There's a reporting and documentation aspect of that law. The French duty of vigilance law, on the other hand, applies to really large companies. Companies in France with 5,000 or more employees, or companies that have a branch in France and have 10,000 or more employees worldwide. And there is a similarity between the French law and the German supply chain law in that it's bifurcated and covers both areas of human rights and environmental risks, and requires a risk assessment and implementation of a risk strategy, and again, publishing that strategy and kind of giving notice to the broader community. The Dutch Child Labor Due Diligence Act, on the other hand, doesn't have a monetary or employment threshold and applies to all companies that sell goods and services in the Netherlands, but the scope of application is really narrow, covering child labor, as the law suggests. Then we have, but I want to mention also in the Netherlands, there is an ongoing discussion over a broad due diligence law, again, similar to the German law, that would expand that scope of coverage even further to companies with 250 or more employees. As I've mentioned, in the United States, the framework is really kind of fragmented, focusing piecemeal on certain areas of coverage. So, for example, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act covers products and services that originate in Xinjiang in China. There is a rebuttable presumption that those products and services are prohibited from entering the United States. We also have an executive order on, the United States has an executive order on child labor. And just this year, the Securities and Exchange Commission published a proposal on climate-related reporting for investors, kind of trying to create standardized metrics for investors around sustainability to kind of channel funds towards those types of projects. So similar to what we see in the corporate reporting, financial reporting directive forthcoming as well in the EU. And speaking of another law that is forthcoming in the EU, we have this draft directive on due diligence. Again, this was published at the beginning of this year and would broaden the scope, if we are thinking about the German law, from 3,000 employees, to companies with 500 employees, and annual turnover of 150 million euros, or companies with 250 employees with 40 million in annual turnover coming from high impact sectors like textiles and forestry. I think this EU law, again, would have a bifurcated focus on human rights and environmental impacts. So before we turn to the German law, I just want to kind of make this case that it's more than just German companies who have to comply with the law, but this law can serve as a really good model as we look towards the future in the EU, likely in the United States, while also making that business case of the importance of complying with sustainable initiatives. So turning to the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, it comes into force at the beginning of next year, January 2023, for really large companies with at least 3,000 employees. And this will likely affect 900 companies, at least directly. Then at the beginning of the following year, that scope of application expands with the threshold limit being lowered to companies with 1,000 employees, where those companies directly affected would be sit somewhere around 5,000 companies.
And as you say, Stephen, these are only the companies that are really directly affected, because you can imagine that other companies also have to do something similar to be able to provide their services or products to those larger companies, right?
Yeah, that's right. We see this distinction in the law between, for example, direct suppliers and indirect suppliers, and those companies having an obligation to that parent company in Germany. So we have this scope of direct application, as Jenny and I have suggested, but nonetheless, there is also this form of self-regulation where these companies are going to be policing, in some sense, their supply chain.
Yeah. And another thing, because we have some international attendees today also, So far as I understood the law, it's not only for German customers or companies, it's also for international companies with subsidiaries in Germany when they hit the 3,000 employee line, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's not just those companies with their administrative headquarters in Germany. It is also, as Uwe has suggested, those companies with branches and subsidiaries in Germany who hit that employment threshold. And the purpose of the law, again, is really to think about and incorporate human rights and environmental protection into an organization's entire supply chain. And so we kind of have this carrot or stick mechanism. Of course, on the one hand, it is really worthwhile for businesses to present themselves sustainably because we have this emerging idea of conscious consumers. Individuals want to put their money towards brands, products, and services that they think are, in some sense, facilitating social good. But on the other hand, we also have employees who want to work for companies who are also, working towards sustainable initiatives to make the world a better place and really provide individuals value in the work that they do. With that said, there are also penalties. So we have the fines listed up to 8 million euros for really large companies. And then there's kind of a piecemeal fines depending on what provisions of the law are violated. And if you reach a certain threshold, then there's also the possibility to be, well, no, not the possibility, you will be also excluded from public contracts. So within the German supply chain law, there are a number of due diligence obligations that are really laid out really nicely, really clearly. There's 9 or 10 depending on how you count them, and they begin with this creation of a risk management system. So I'm going to highlight what you see on the screen at the moment is kind of trying to lay out. Or I'm not trying to lay out, it is laying out a comprehensive way to comply with those due diligence obligations within our product that Jenny will demo for you in just a moment. But nonetheless, I will talk you through kind of the ideas that that have informed how we've looked at developing this due diligence product. And so, it really begins with looking at that, like the life cycle of your supplier. So beginning, with that supplier selection process and assessing those risks and doing this in a really broad manner. So beginning looking at the risks of the geographic location. So for example, many companies get products and services from China. China had that no COVID policy, which really made it, kind of created a bottleneck that we saw during that COVID period. And then organizations then need to be able to pivot quickly to identify suppliers who can supply them with those products and services that they need to reach those end consumers. So from looking at that geographic risk, then we look at tiering potential suppliers, potential and actual suppliers, to create this and look at this distinction again between these direct and indirect suppliers. Because as I've mentioned, there are differing obligations as it relates to these organizations. From there, we look at the individual supplier assessment. So really drilling down on that company, that supplier, that vendor, to see how they manage their human rights and environmental risks. And then putting in place those contractual assurances to ensure these organizations are also complying with your organization's human rights and environmental initiatives. Then we have the basic risk management and analysis, thinking about the probability of violations, the severity of the consequences, and the degree and ability to influence these suppliers. From that beginning supplier selection aspect, and we think about preventive measures to, as it suggests, prevent any violations and limit the risks throughout your supply chain. And that starts with issuing a policy statement and the German law lays out what specifically needs to be within that policy statement, identifying those priority risks, and then having this mechanism of training employees and suppliers to comply with those programs.
And I've come across actually quite a lot of companies that do that supplier training, that help their suppliers as well to be compliant with it, because I guess it's an obligation for you, but then you at least can make sure that your supplier again does the right things too, after those trainings.
It's pretty important.
Yeah, I mean, building those relationships is, as you suggested, really important. That it creates an understanding of what's going on, like really concretely, and allows you to work with those companies and those organizations to facilitate a program that works really on both ends. From those preventive measures, there are instances of violations. So then we think about remedial actions. So if violations are discovered, for example, in your own business area, in Germany, you have to put those immediately to an end. And then there are differing aspects of response, depending again on if it's a direct supplier or an indirect supplier. The obligation is often not to end that business relationship, but really to try to work with those organizations to stop those violations and mitigate those possibilities. And then there is also the requirement to implement a complaints procedure. Organizations can only do so much about creating an understanding of what's going on in the supply chains. The complaints procedure really gives a mechanism for employees, for suppliers to create a holistic understanding around risks and violations in human rights and environmental risks. And then lastly, there is this opportunity for organizations who have to document what they're doing throughout the year. So kind of this idea of know what's going on in your supply chain and then be able to show it in these reports and this documentation. It has to be published annually and made available at the end of 4 months after the end of the financial year. And this is, again, another example for organizations to kind of, in some sense, market what they're doing around sustainability.
Yeah, I love that you call it an opportunity, because I think it is. I think most, especially in the consumer market, for example, you'd rather work with somebody, but also in a B2B business, of course, work with somebody is doing the right things.
Yeah, and when a company already is impacted by this law or this Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, they can't work with anyone who does not comply.
Yeah, exactly. And so, again, I think the German law really gives you a holistic scope to look at managing due diligence obligations throughout your supply chain. Even if you are outside of the country, and it's also important to keep in mind for suppliers of German companies.
Definitely. Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Stephen. Really appreciate that. I think that gives everybody hopefully a very good understanding of that there are quite some obligations that all organizations now have to meet, actually. So Willie, what do those regulations really mean for our customers, for companies right now, not in Germany, but also outside Germany, of course? So
first, of course, we heard right now from Stephen, they need to comply by 1st of January. So the bigger ones, threshold right now is 3,000 employees, right? Next year or the year after next year in 24, it's coming down to 1,000. So many companies are impacted. We already spoke about international or subsidiaries of international companies. So to be honest, we got the first inquiries from outside Germany, where customers asking, hey, we have a subsidiary in Germany. What is with the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act? What does it mean for our subsidiary in Germany? How can we work here with, and especially we talk about big accounts, big companies with thousands and 10,000s of vendors and suppliers. So how should they manage and handle all this? My answer at the end, of course, it's a digital solution. You need a digital solution to manage all this, because we are in a very complex supply chain world. Everyone is connected around the whole globe. And you need to know also not only your tier 1, but also afterwards the tier 2 and tier 3 vendor, and get transparency what happens there. And what I also experienced, since we have all this crisis, beginning with the pandemic, then we have the Ukraine war in Europe very strong, the energy crisis now, we see broken supply chains, disruptions in the supply chains. This is also what customers are caring for, and to be honest, much more. The one thing is to become compliant. The other thing is, how can I keep my business up and running when I need supplies from all over the world and logistics is no longer working.
Yeah, cost aspect of it as well, yeah. Because, what was it? I think organizations, they estimate that the broken supply chain can cost organizations up to $180 million per disruption. So that's a lot of money to, to not invest in it and not try to at least map the supply chain as good as possible, get opportunities for alternatives and all of that. So do companies think about that financial impact too now?
Of course, of course. We have on the one side, you mentioned it, the fines on the compliance side, but shutting down a factory, for example, not able to deliver products or to sell products because of a broken supply chain, this hits our customers much more. And they need, and this is a C-level topic right now, they need transparency, what happens in the supply chain, and they don't need assessment like they did over the past years, quality, how does my vendor perform based on price, reliability, and so on. They need it in real time now. They want to see what happens, how could a shutdown somewhere in Asia impact my own business, on the supply chain side, but also on the market side. This is at the hottest line currently with our customers.
So not only optimizing the supply chain, but also having that resilience in the supply chain to be able to react if something goes wrong. So, but it's very difficult, of course, to get that insight in the supply chain. I mean, it's, you guys figure out, it's like 10,000, 20,000 or more suppliers that companies have. So how could they best do that? So how do companies deal with it now, for example? What do they do?
Of course, I'm working for a digital transformation company, so we're helping customers to get this transparency, to get a view on their supply chain, and together with partner like you, Wrangu, you built an excellent solution based on our vendor risk management and integrated risk management tools. And I think you will get some insights on the solution afterwards. But the sheer amount of vendors, you can't manage this without a digital solution. And of course, we have something which helps our customers.
Yeah, because very often it's only like a point in time, right? I mean, we had that conversation. I think it's 11% continuously monitor their suppliers, which is, it's just because it's such a big effort, I think, to do.
Right, and you need to help your procurement departments, your CEOs, and so on, to stay productive. And on the one side, we have the laws, but on the other side, the threat in the logistic and supply chain. You need to help them to stay productive.
Yeah, definitely. And as you're saying, of course, we have a joint solution. We have developed a joint solution actually that is built on ServiceNow's vendor risk management, on the integrated risk management, and on a, if you want to, content success pack for the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. And let's just talk through it, because it's kind of around what Stephen said earlier, of course, the whole process that you have to follow with the new legislation coming. And the first thing is, of course, that you need that transparency. What does my supply chain look like? You know your first, your direct suppliers, you normally know, but under that, it's already getting quite difficult. And if you then have an obligation to even look further down in the supply chain, it's getting more and more difficult, of course.
Yeah, and sometimes our customer finds out that in the third or fourth here they have this no backup anymore, yeah?
Exactly.
And then it's the same vendor who provides service or products to other tiers.
Exactly. So they have the raw material provider for everything in the end. Yeah, exactly. So the thing that we have developed is actually really following those steps that Stephen laid out. So the first thing is that we assess our direct suppliers on business criticality, because we care more about those that are really crucial to our value chain in the organization or a specific supply chain than the one that might deliver pencils to us or something, because it's also much easier to find a replacement for somebody who delivers pencils. But if it's something that is really crucial to us as a company, we need to know that. So that is really the first thing, to assess that internally. So who are really my business critical suppliers? And then we can, of course, communicate with those suppliers, because ServiceNow's vendor portal actually gives you the ability to then send out questionnaires digitally to those suppliers, ask them to provide more information, ask them to upload some information, for example. And what we've done is that based on the outcome of that first hearing assessment, you get different questionnaires that are sent automatically to those suppliers, because you don't want to bother that pencil supplier with 50,000 questions, but you want to make sure that the business critical ones are really answering the questions that are important to you as an organization and important for you to be compliant.
Yeah, and the good one is we speak about digital questionnaire, not a PDF sent as an attachment via email, and then you get something handwritten back. No, we talk about the digital world. Yeah.
Exactly. And the other thing that we're also capturing in it is who are actually your suppliers, my supplier. So I'm asking that supplier, but who supplies those services or goods to you? So that already gives us more insight in what does the supply chain underneath look like.
And it's really documenting that and giving you that audit trail, allowing you to see where you've been and where you are going.
Exactly, because that portal also then gives you the ability to, as an internal person in the organization, as the vendor manager, to flag any issues, and that can be also automatic, for example. It might be that because I'm dealing, you were talking about geographical risks, because I got a sub-supplier that is working in a specific geo, I might raise a risk already. It might already be a bit more critical. I'd have to have a better look at it. So I can flag all those things, or they can be flagged automatically, and I can ask my supplier again digitally to kind of react to it. I can work with the supplier. As you said, we have to work with those suppliers to really solve any possible issues, or to make sure that they know what they have to do, make sure that they have to change a policy maybe, or make sure that specific controls are in place at theirs as well.
Yeah, and the user interface is also pretty nice. It's easy to understand for everyone, so it's not very complex and not very complicated. This is, I think it needs to be easy also for both sides, for the supplier, but also for me as a responsible guy in the procurement.
Definitely, because it's a lot of effort that is coming to companies, so we have to make sure that it's as easy as possible. And then when we're talking about risk, there are of course also organizations and companies that provide data already. So provide insight and risk ratings of companies. So for example, Interos has something like that. BitSight gives valuable information, but there are also loads of open source pages that show us risks of geographics for specific industries in specific countries. And so we can actually use that to enrich the data that we have about our suppliers.
And the guys like Interos, for example, you mentioned it, are easily to be connected to ServiceNow, so it's out of the box available.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, so apart from the process that we support with our solution, with the joint solution, we also brought in actually the regulation itself. Because from a compliance perspective, we now have, of course, to measure, do we comply with regulation? And that is, for example, do we as an organization have a minimum wage policy? Do we have a gender equality policy, carbon neutral, so how travel policies? There's all kinds of things that we have to do internally as well. And by bringing that into the integrated risk management module, we can then really measure compliance with the Corporate Due Diligence Act, actually.
And we're saying we have it also in German.
Yes, yes, definitely. But the name is, of course, really long, so yeah. And of course, transparency, and we talked about that before. Very important. The different stakeholders in the organization need to know what's going on in real time, need to be able to drill down. So we have new roles, head of sustainability. And so how do those people really get insight? So we have loads of different dashboards where they can see possible violations, can zoom in, and yeah.
And this is really what also the C-level loves, dashboards to see where I am today. So it's real time, and by fingertip you can drill down on the different vendors, different risks, what's popping up. And you mentioned sustainability manager, for example. This is also the first step. So the whole law also gives customers a first step to do a proper environmental and social governance management law, call it ESG, where we as ServiceNow has also a solution for. So everything connects to each other.
Yeah,
good.
Everything feeds each other, exactly. So it's, yeah, fantastic. But of course, so one is that you manage your suppliers, that you are proactive if something happens. So for example, all that data that we then capture in the solution also gives you the ability to have the data for your annual report available. So what Stephen was talking about, April, you have to provide a report. If you already capture in a system what kind of, if you had any violations, what you have done, and you have a 100% audit trail with it, you only need to get it on paper or publish it on your website as a company, and you got everything in place. And the other thing is, if then really a crisis happens, in case something happens, I want to know which of my suppliers are really affected by that. And that's where we're going to bring in, or where we're bringing in business continuity management, actually, because if there is an event, and that can be all kinds of external feeds that come into the system, we know exactly what suppliers are affected. We know who we need to notify. We know who can be our alternative suppliers for that. And we can really have a very quick reaction to it and make all of that really actionable.
So then you can solve two topics. One is this compliance thing with the Due Diligence Act, and then the other one, which is disruption of supply chains. Great, love to see this.
Cool. So that was just an overview of how, with ServiceNow's vendor risk management, integrated risk management, and our supply chain solution from Wrangu, how we can then really help you to manage the risk in the supply chain in a very effective and efficient way. So we're of course very happy to have further conversations with you, so please just reach out. And now it's time for questions. Do we have any questions in the audience? Let me just check this one. So please feel free to ask any questions, and if there are no questions right away, I would say please reach out to us. We're very happy to have further conversations, to have more in-depth conversations of what we can do for your specific organization. Really, Stephen, anything from your side?
From my side, I think what I saw based on our solutions and products, we have excellent solution which helps customers to overcome challenges with, on the one side, the law, but on the other side also everything what happens with all the crises around us. Thank you for this. Thank you for inviting me also. Was a great pleasure for me.
Yeah, and we do have to say, we have the question if the solution is available. Yes, the solution is already available, so we can show this in much more detail. And so I hope that answers the question. We have another question here. In the due diligence slide, the penalty for public contracts was not within the scope. Could you please explain why? I think that's a question for you, Stephen.
I'm just trying to get the understanding. In the due diligence slide, the penalty for public contract was not within the scope. Could you please explain why? So I think perhaps this is referencing that threshold where there's the exclusion from public contracts. And so, there are particular fines that relate to the due diligence obligations within the law. So, if you don't have like a risk management system in place. Okay, the fine is at a certain threshold if you haven't conducted your risk analysis. Again, a certain threshold. If you haven't done it on an annual basis, okay, you have a fine of a certain level. And that threshold where there's the exclusion from public contract is 175,000 euros. So when you aggregate all of those fines and it adds up to that, then there's the exclusion from public contracts.
Okay, so you could be there very quickly. Or
yeah, certainly,
okay.
because the fines they can come one at a time. If the fines aren't remediated or rectified within a certain time, okay, you are being fined further and further.
Okay.
Interesting.
That's an interesting one. Yeah, thank you.
And I think one really interesting aspect to highlight about this German law is really the scope of the human rights obligations.
Mm-hmm.
It's really expanding how we are thinking about human rights. Access to clean water, clean air. This is all really falling under that scope of human rights. Those things that we need to proliferate, to continue to live a happy and healthy life. For now and into the future, and I think that's a really interesting and novel approach from the German regulators.
And actually, a very nice way to, I think, finish the discussion. So it's something we really need to, for the future. So I think, I hope that was an interesting webinar, and we were able to give you a bit of insight on what's coming, but also how we can really help you. So.
And of course, happy to talk with you if you have any further questions or interest also in the solution and the IRM and VRM and our ESG products and so on. So please don't be shy. We want to pick up this.
Yeah, reach out to anybody here on the panel or reach out to your ServiceNow account manager. And thank you very much for your time today.
Bye.